course, people want to know, is there neuroscience evidence for type? There's already genetic evidence with the study of twins raised separately. So I think it's not a surprise to say yes, that type matters. That said, upbringing and career choice, and now having the chance to look a lot more in depth with couples and seeing the impact of relationships, that those also play a big role, and that all type practitioners, I think we all know this in theory, but to really practice it, that think when you come in with a client that type is just maybe 50%, which is actually not just, it's a lot. That's like a huge boon to be able to start off with a sense of 50% of what you know going on with the person. But the career plays a big part, and so does the upbringing. Just the last time it was at the British Type Conference, and have all these really great folks come in, and afterwards, I think there were about 20 Brits total. And then comparing that average British brain to the average American brain going to the American Type Conference. And, because similar professions and similar age groups and so on. And I sort of joked to myself that of course, Brits will be more tuned into the abstract use of language. You all, for example, have poetry study in schools, and metaphor and wittiness or sarcasm. All of those things are prized. And it turns out actually to be the case, that this region in the right brain, but sort of this corresponds to language that's in the left, abstract use of language, is much more well connected. I think it was like 17 out of 20 of the subjects in the UK. And we might see that same pattern in 1 out of 20 here in the US.
Okay, wow. So we really have a culturally different brain in the UK.
Yes. So that's at least around that one thing. If I dig more deeply, there might be more. But I think that's a reminder of where it is, and that's sort of the direction I've been going. And just trying to help people identify what are their skills, how are they unique. An INFP who's worked for 30 years as an engineer is going to be different than an INFP who's done 30 years as a musician or a painter or something. And sometimes when people come and they're trying to find their best fit type, they may not match the stereotype of that type. And, INTP professor or whatever it is. And to understand, so I think it helps people break out of some of those stereotypes to see, here's how I'm getting my type needs met, is just not in the usual way that people might think.
So how much can people deviate from what you'd expect from a type then?
I know that seems maybe odd to say, but it seems to somewhat depend on type and certainly on age. ENFP is probably the type that's most consistently an ENFP because the way their brain is wired is to be jack of all trades and master of none. And so that works across a lot of different things. So their brain doesn't need to rewire in order to get something done somewhere else as they go through their career or whatever it is. Some others, certainly amongst the SJ types, you can see quite a bit, ironically, of some really extreme differences depending upon what their training is as an accountant or as a gardener or that kind of thing. They really take it very seriously. You can see that reflected in the brain. But overall, I would say age, culture, career, that those all have some influence. And for most people, it's about 1/3 of the results, and we still get quite a bit that matches with type. And when it doesn't match with type, by the way, it's usually matching with the opposite type in some way. Now, maybe that's a little, opposite of sensing is intuiting, opposite of thinking is feeling. Well, then we've covered all 4 functions. So maybe this is a little bit of an easy thing to find. But I do find that. But for some people, it could be as much as half and half. And then some folks really are just straight down the line, like what you would expect. I would say nobody is surprised by their results, though. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when you see this sort of specializations that people have, they can relate and go, oh, that's because I did this when I was in my 20s or something like that. Is that how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I often have found that the biggest buy-in, where people say their best experience is seeing something in the results that makes sense to them that is from their teens or childhood. And even for me, when I finally, brought in myself as a subject, like 7 years on into my research, at first I was surprised by some of the results in the right brain with body motion and so on. And then I realized as a child that I learned surfing, skiing, ice skating, roller skating, all of these, and did well in really all of them. And I retained all of that in my brain, even though I don't do very much of that now.
And do you think, I suppose it's a case that maybe the brain's more plastic, we learn better when we're younger. How easy is it to build these changes as we get older?
Well, that is something that's really interested me and has gone sort of hand in hand with research that might look like it's more Jungian in nature or more abstract, getting into the individuation, a transcendent function, midlife, yoga, those kinds of things. I do believe that when a person is more fully immersed in whatever it is that they're doing, so it's very multisensory, it's pushing them into a challenge zone. So they're going to a new environment, they're doing something physical as well as mental, as well as emotional, that offers a lot more opportunity for growth and change. And then we do know, generally in neuroscience, that there are these windows of time to make new habits or break old habits. And that's not something that happens easily. So for very minor things, it might be a few weeks to build a habit. For more difficult things, it might take 3 months. But that wiring can occur. So when somebody really makes a big life change, or as they say, like goes on a life adventure for a year or 3 months or whatever it is, that they can have a lasting impact. I don't know about 3 months really, but certainly 6 months or a year can have a lasting impact on people's brains.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Yeah.
so there is hope for all of us to improve in things that we're not so good at right now.
Absolutely. I would say both in skill terms and in type terms. I would never go back to before age 45 because I feel like I've learned so much the last few years that I didn't know when I was 40 or 30 or 20 or God forbid 15. So that's, yeah, there definitely is hope in both the type domain and elsewhere, although I think that we need to make a concerted choice to explore that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant. And so when you try to look back now to when you first learned about type, when you first got involved with it, like, can you paint a picture of what was going on for you at the time and how did you get into it?
Well, I got into type when in university. I was in graduate school, or the beginning of it, and 2 friends introduced me. They actually were talking, they were sitting together using strange letters, analyzing the people around them, and I wanted to know what they were talking about. So one of them gave me the little test that's at the beginning of David Kiersey's Please Understand Me. And I took that and I scored as INTJ, and I read through that, and I found, yeah, that fits really well, and I began paging through it and seeing, oh, this is my mom, and this is my dad, and this is my younger sister, and my older sister, and my aunt and uncle, and so on. It seemed really easy to reading for the people I knew well. So I was excited, and I took it home to my family, and no one except my mom took an interest in it. And but my mom did take a look, and one morning she came to me and she said, Dario, I had a dream last night. And in the dream, it said that this is really important. This is going to influence the rest of your life, and you need to get certified or whatever they do with this. And because Christmas holiday was coming up and my birthday was soon after, she said, this is going to be like a special gift, and we're going to find out who can get you certified and make that happen. And so that's how I met Linda Behrens when I did type certification. That was back in 1994, I believe. And it's really funny. So that's when I met other people in the type community who have also continued from that very same training. Linda Ernst and Melissa Smith here in the States, also Susan Nash, who you all know. And it was just it was really fortuitous. And a month later, I then started working with Linda on something else. And then that slowly led into me doing some statistical analysis for her, and then some editing, and then finally co-authoring a book. And about well, no, that was like 4 years later or something like that. And so that was the beginning. And that was, I mean, I certainly have to credit Linda Behrens and my mom for bringing me on the on-ramp and then taking me through the full, type experience. And I didn't get involved in the brain imaging until, 2006 or so. And that I have to credit Catherine Hirsch, and not for the work or whatnot, but because she gently suggested that perhaps Dario would be a good person to explore neuroscience and type. And so when the opportunity came up 5 years later, I remembered what she said and took that to heart. And so that began the research process.
Cool. And then from that point, you started getting people and putting skull caps on them with jelly to make the electrodes contact, and gave them tasks to do. And now you've done 300 of those at least now by the sound of it. Is that right?
Yes. Although, the type that's most difficult to get is the one that's supposedly most common in the United States, which is ESTJ.
Okay. Have you seen how many have you seen in your 300?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I'm not even sure I've made 10 yet. I mean, I know I have 6 or 8, something like that. I may have as many as 10. I'm not quite sure. Haven't done an update. But compared to the 30 INTPs, it's a little paltry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What are the ESTJs busy doing instead of being in your laboratory?
Well, I don't know a lot of ESTJs. And by the way, I have enough ISTJs. It's just ESTJ. And for a time, I also was really touch and go with ESTP. But with ESTP, it's a little bit easier because the motivation for how to bring them in, like it's got to be quick and there has to be some kind of obvious benefit or outcome that comes with it. And that's, so I've tried to bribe ESTPs with beer, special beer from Australia, whatever it is. But I found that if I frame it in terms like with the couples, all of a sudden I've gotten a lot more type diversity by really saying it's free, but only if you're a couple and only during this 3-month window that I have the interns. And that has really then brought in a bunch of folks that of various types, which has really helped a lot. Yeah.
What's the most common type that you've worked with in your scanning work?
I'd say all of the IN types. And really quite a number of ENFP as well. So those are probably tons though of ISFP, fair number of the other SF types too. They like to volunteer. I asked them, they're sort of intrigued. As long as they're not frightened by it, then that's, so no, I do have a number of sensing types. There's just these few little pockets that I want to keep working at before I publish like a version 2.0 of my book. And a lot has happened since the original version, for sure. Now when people get the old book, I'm like, try and get this at least like this little temporary book, Our Brains in Color, as like a bridge before I put out a new one. Because the new one will definitely bring in a lot of new stuff, and it needs to be fair to all of the types.
Yeah, and the first book is Neuroscience of Personality, right? Is that the book?
Yes, Neuroscience of Personality, yeah. And that's really reporting on a pilot study with 65 American university students, which is, there was some good ethnic diversity, but not the age diversity that I would have really wanted. And it's really helped a lot now to really focus on all ages and people from different backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. And what's the most exciting thing that you're dying to put into version 2?
Oh, that's a good question. I say what's so different from version 1. Version 1 just looked at the individual brain regions and how active or not they were, which seems like a pretty fair measure when you look at college students who are still developing their core skill set. When I've looked at older folks, really everybody being able to go beyond just the individual regions and actually look at networks in the brain. So like, how are different regions connected and how do they work together? And there seem to be, I don't know how you want to divvy it up, a half dozen or dozen different typical patterns that people show. Like the starburst pattern that's indicative of the sort of creative brainstorm capacity. That isn't exclusive to dominant intuiting types, people who are in very creative professions, people who are left-handed with sensing preference, just young people in general seem to show that more often. So there are these other factors besides that, but it is exciting to see these different networks, and it's and I think what makes it fun for the average person is that just looking at the network diagram itself maybe doesn't give them they don't know how to interpret it unless I help them, give them like a little cheat sheet. But when they compare theirs to somebody else's, like their spouse, then just looking at them visually, we have some intuitions. Like, oh, this one looks very orderly, or this one is very left brain, or this one has a starburst pattern, or this one has tons of diagonals in it, like crossing the different hemispheres. And they do have a sense of like, oh yeah, that does sort of feel like you. And this one sort of feels like me. So and just for people to even see like how different or similar their brains are. I think that's pretty exciting for people. And that's I would say, and then there's lots and lots of individual application areas. So with emotions, with so what I call executive styles, which are very similar to the attitudes in the type code. So EJ, IJ, EP, IP, or the interaction styles, very, very similar to that. So there are these different application areas, and those I hadn't developed yet. I didn't know what those were yet.
So these networks are going to feature more, and they're things which you can see in your patterns on the screen when you're looking at this work. And you've got, for anyone who's not seen it, you've got different, I don't know if you still have this, but the different colors that come up in, how many is it? 16 different regions of the brain, of the cortex?
19 now.
19.
I have a new one that it actually has space for 7 more, but my caps only allow for 3 more. So it's, if business is good this month, I'll be bringing a cap that has 23 sensors. That's a custom one. Otherwise, we'll just be getting the 19s.
And what will that tell you? How are the extra regions helpful?
Well, to some extent, just having more regions is good because we're covering a really sort of big area of the brain, like a full square inch in size. I would say roughly, maybe a little bit more than that, with each sensor. And so that region can cover a variety of different things, which are sort of related, but they're still different. As an example could be in this region here in the left temple area, it's responsible, it helps us with things like working memory, imitating others in order to learn. So like you watch someone play tennis and how they swing the racket, and then you too are going to imitate them and swing that way. But it also helps us with things like analogies and using our imagination to visualize a place we haven't been to or something like that, to construct something in our mind's eye. So I've mentioned 4 different things. And the sensing folks seem to be better at the first 2, and intuiting folks seem to be better at the second 2. But I actually don't know which one is which unless I stop and ask them afterward, like, what were you doing when that was very active? So just having more sensors is useful. And then right now the caps allow for also the center regions of the brain, not just on each side, but to know how those different regions communicate with each other. And in at least 2 of the 3 of those have actually a bit of research about them out there is written up. And so that was a really great starting point. People had done fMRI research, so different equipment, but still studying the same area of the brain. And just being able to look at some things that seem very related, those 2 in particular, to intuiting and to thinking preferences. And that's, but it's exciting when there's even a little bit of an advance like that.
It's exciting. Yeah. And what about other research? I mean, I guess you're in a minority of people working with neuroscience and psychological type. How does this sort of integrate with the wider field and other academics and people that you meet in the field?
Well, I'd say there's 2 or 3 things. One is, of course, there are some people ask me why I'm not doing this with 5-factor model or something like that. My response is that I'm not so much using type in terms of the 4-letter code as I was inspired by Jung's model of cognitive processes. In other words, these mental functions that we have. Whereas something like 5-factor model is a trait model. Like you're conscientious, that's a behavior that means you like things orderly on the outside. It doesn't say anything about how you're conscientious or what that means in the larger picture of how your brain works or something like that. And so I'm not really surprised the studies out there with five-factor model haven't really gotten very much interesting information, looking at the brain and that. And then it's a little bit of the same, the recently Journal of Psychological Type did publish an article last year. Some other folks are doing some brain research with EEG, and same as me, and they're giving people the MBTI and doing some type confirmation, I hope. And they give them 12 minutes in the cap, just 12 minutes. 6 minutes with eyes closed, just sitting there, and 6 minutes with eyes open. And that is a sort of very standard thing to do, but to me it's completely uninteresting, because I think what I'm doing that's different, no matter what model this neuroscience person is trying to relate it to, is that I'm giving them a full hour of activities to do. That each one is 2 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe 5 minutes at the most. And then they move to something else, and they're all jumbled up. So it could be listening to music, and then doing a memory activity, and then drawing, and then doing something with money. And so there's a lot of variety to stimulate the brain in different ways, to have a conversation, to explain what's going on, to have other people, so the person's being stimulated by social activity. That's where I feel like what I'm doing is actually different. No, I'm not the only one to do that. What's called the Human Connectome Project, which uses fMRI, they still put people in an fMRI machine, but the person is at least doing a variety of activities. And the results in terms of the brain regions and functionality are very similar to mine. Look at the slides, and I'm not surprised, but they are. So I would say that's really what's different. The only people who don't like my work are 2 or 3 that I can think of are graduate students. And I'm just like, you just need real world experience, that's all. And that's, I feel very confident at this point. I've never actually gotten pushback from another neuroscience person. And to the extent there were suggestions, it's been about things like the color coding scheme to make sure that people in neuroscience aren't confused, even if it's easier for the layperson to understand. Those kinds of things. But with the actual approach to the research, no, because a lot of what I'm doing is really not, it's not bizarre or something. It's just bringing together familiar elements in a way that maybe isn't being done elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, is this, how much interest have you had from academic journals and things to write about your research and publish it, like peer-reviewed research and that kind of thing?
Well, I haven't pursued it, and at least how it works here is, for the most part, you have to pursue it. In part is I didn't do that before with the pilot research, because I just felt it's pilot research. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm learning. This is not a research study. And here, at least, you also need to get human subject research clearance and a number and everything before you even start your research. So that made it a little bit difficult. In terms of now collecting all of these people, yes, of course, I'd like to publish, but it needs to be done sort of strategically, waiting until there's enough people, which I feel pretty good about, having enough time to analyze the research in the different ways that people expect, getting feedback on that, and then also having a version of the published research that's focused on the type folks rather than people in neuroscience, where I might not even mention type that much. That would just be one thing that would come up. So it really hasn't been on the forefront of my mind, even though it will be at some point. And yes, I keep thinking, oh, this is the year that I'll do the 2.0 book, and before that I actually need to do a research paper, but it hasn't happened yet. Too many other projects get in the way, and one of these days, yeah.
Well, it'd be nice to see some some papers and because it gives us type more of a evidence, that will support what everybody in the community does, and that's one of the issues. Sometimes there's a lack of, it's a self-perpetuating philosophy, isn't it? That if the research isn't there, people don't do research, and that's one of the big problems. So
yeah.
it'd be great to see that.
And I am happy that there is some research, like I mentioned, published in the journal just last year. But I think some of it is people need to be given an example where the analysis is sophisticated enough. And I don't mean impenetrable or overly complex. I mean, just looks at the angles that are actually useful to get results back. that there's more than just saying, like, here are these brain regions, how active were they over these different types, and what's statistically significant. I think there's a lot more value to be gained than that. And so some of that is I'm not sure how to present, but I absolutely agree. In terms of my interns who come, like, I've actually created things like this 10 or 12 page white paper that explains like what I do and how it's analyzed and all of that. But that's not something that I've published yet. That's just a white paper that's for them to work off of. So I will say eventually it's going to happen. Research doesn't happen quickly. And I'd like it to stick when it does happen. So when the time is right and I feel like it's very supportable, then that's when it's going to come forward.
Yeah. It sounds like a good strategy. So moving on to another question then, the functions, the 8 functions are very central to what you do. Jung's 8 functions, or the cognitive processes, as some people call them. I mean, they're functions of the mind. You know, and you're using imaging and scanning of the brain, and and there's this big debates going on of how are the brain and mind linked, and what is your current take on that?
My current take is that there's really 3 words that we can use. One of them is brain, one of them is mind, and the third one is psyche. And so neuroscientists concern themselves with the brain, and a lot of neuroscientists will say there's only the brain. Cognitive science, which is a different discipline, concerns itself mainly with the mind. And they'll say things like, oh, the actual instantiation, like whether it's a brain or a computer or whatever, like that doesn't matter. What matters is information processing, which they mean in our type language, perceiving and deciding kinds of activities. Sorting, comparing, contrasting, remembering, all of that. And then psyche is the domain of psychology. Not necessarily, there are psychologists now who go into all these different directions, but it's not just, if we think of the brain as the hardware and then the mind as the informational level, so that would be the software. That psyche then is the systems level. So that includes the environment and culture and the person's place in it and all of that. I'd like to say that the hardware is like my Mac, that's the brain. The software is like the operating system and the various applications I have running on my desktop. And then the psyche is actually the content. Say I launch Microsoft Word and I'm typing some letter. The psyche is actually what's in the letter, which has nothing to do necessarily with the operating system or like the hardware circuits that are underneath it, the logic gates. So that's how I sort of differentiate those. And I would say, Jung he said mental functions. So I think that suggests it has to do with the mind. And I see it as the mental functions sort of sit like here's psyche, which includes things like archetypes and shadow and unconscious. And then there's mind stuff, information processing, and type could often just be presented in terms of the mind stuff. But at times, a practitioner may say, yeah, let's go a little bit deeper and talk about type development or type dynamics or something like that in a way that takes a little bit into the realm of psyche. And that's why I feel like you can take 2 people of the same type and they have very different careers and some different brain wiring and so on. So the brain is different. The mind may even be a little bit different. And of course, like what's going on in the psyche, like there's that same pattern there. 2 INTJs or whatever it is. Yeah.
Interesting stuff. I mean, this is really at the deepest heart of psychology and science, really, what we're talking about, isn't it? It really gets to the nub of who we are and what we are and how it's all related, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Well, I suppose those are the interesting questions, right?
Yeah. So where we've got 5 minutes left, we've got a question from Terry in Sydney, but I might see if we can fit that in at the end because it might get us into another area as well. I just want to quickly talk about your book that's you've written recently, the Jung and Yoga. Is that the title?
Yes, I was just looking around for a copy of it and then realized I've given all the copies away that I have in my office. So yeah, I recently, last year, I completed a new book, Jung on Yoga. Many people don't know that, I certainly didn't know 2 years ago, that Jung spoke at length in the 1930s about yoga. And I don't mean the hatha exercise yoga that people go and do. He's talking about like the Hindu, Sikh, thousands of years old traditions. So there is, as there always is with Jung, some mystical veneer that comes with it. But it was really, really cool to read that. And he really, one of the things that motivated me is he takes his own work and places it within that body of yoga wisdom that's there, and says, this is where my work is. Another is that, he's quoted as saying in a different work that yoga has actually been the highest human achievement, and that it happened to have come out of the East, but it's not the most appropriate tool at this time in the West. Of course, he was speaking in the 1930s, not today. So maybe there's something to do to talk about with this highest achievement, if Jung thought that was this. I would say also it brings in the body. So the nervous system runs throughout the whole body, and it's really cool to be looking at the brain. And when you ask people to point to where their consciousness is, I mean, Americans are going to say, Europeans, Westerners, that it's here, it's in the head. But in practice, the nervous system runs throughout all the organs of the body, extensively so. And in fact, 80% of the signals are going up from the body into the brain. Only 20% are going down. So there's a lot of information in the question, especially with the theme of the conference, in a very sort of, I would say, nonstop, 24-hour technological society where being in nature is considered a break from being in work and everything else. That what kind of effect is that having on our, not just stress levels, but mindset and all of that. And I didn't realize it at the time, but Steve Myers has been working on sort of a parallel project on one-sidedness and Jung's work on the transcendent function and so on. I'm pleased to have actually reviewed the book, read through it, and so on just a month ago. Also getting to Jung and talking about type and the transcendent function, and trying to reconnect psychological types as a book back to his larger body of work. And that's really felt, even though it seems like yoga is like a little bit of a diversion, I didn't see it that way, because Jung has this style where he just takes some ideas and he throws them up in the air, and then he's like, oh, look at all those patterns that we see. And there's something to be gained, he believes, from engaging in that process. And I believe that's true, especially if that's connected to some kind of type development practice in everyday life. And so that's, so at the conference, I mean, certainly I'm going to be talking about consciousness, as it's the title of the keynote, but also how does that connect with type as we know it, and then this larger question of how well, I think it's particularly salient now, because it seems like when people are under stress, they can become more one-sided. And when we're bombarded constantly with a lot of stressors from different directions all the time, when the role is, whether it's the computer giving, prompts, or it's the phone, people actually have addiction responses to their phones that are not unlike the nicotine, for example. I mean, there are studies on this, that maybe we really do need to think twice about how can we continue development or take that seriously when everything pushes us to be more one-sided. And I really felt yoga was a good example of how to sort of point out the one-sidedness and what does the bigger picture look like and how does that connect to type. And that's, I'm happy to say Nicole Gruhl, some of you may know her, reviewed the book, and it's coming out in the American Bulletin, and she has a nice little quote. And it's, namely, Jung believed the opposition of forces within the psyche creates important opportunities for a person to transcend the tension, and there's these tension of opposites, and continuously grow in new ways of being and knowing in the world. I thought that was really lovely. And then she says that Jung on Yoga is an insightful breath of fresh air that returns typology to its intended roots of individuation and active awakening. Nice. And that's, it is very sweet, and I think it's true too. I mean, as best as I could offer right now.
It's interesting stuff. I'm looking forward to seeing your book, Young and Yoga. I'm looking forward to hearing your talk at the BAPT conference. You're giving a keynote at the conference, everybody, 12th to 14th of April. I
want to add, if folks are really interested in the topic that we've been talking about today, on the 15th at the conference site is a day-long workshop on consciousness and type development.
Absolutely. Dario's workshop on the Sunday, absolutely important to push that as well, because it's a rare opportunity to get a whole day right with Dario and looking at this fascinating work and ideas. So yeah, book the conference, book Dario's workshop, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Somebody has asked 2 questions, and I can give very brief answers to them. Okay, one is are commercial enterprises picking this up? And the answer is yes. Now, slowly but steadily they are. And is there a book or something I would suggest? I would suggest the movie Annihilation, which is the most Jungian movie I have seen in years.
There we go. Thanks for answering the question.
That answers our question then. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to Terry we didn't go into his, but that could take a while to answer that one. So we're going to have to wrap it up now. We've run out of time. And thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Dario, for spending your time speaking with us. So we wish you a safe trip over to the UK, and we'll see you in April. Everybody, this is the last of our In Conversation With for the time being, although we've got a special 90-minute webinar with Sandra Strope from the USA on leveraging your MBTI strengths to thrive in your career. If you go to the bapt.org.uk website and the events page, you can book for that. That's on the 20th of March. I think we've got 1 day left before the conference early bird discount finishes, so get in there quick. And that's all for now. Thank you, Dario. We'll see you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.